Rachel, 34. Never expected her job as a forensic accountant for the IRS to crash headfirst into family politics. Her brother-in-law, Nathan, married Victoria Langston, a woman who could turn a dinner napkin into a status symbol and every family gathering into a power play. Victoria's booming real estate firm made her the star of every room. Meanwhile, Rachel's steady government career, just more fuel for Victoria's smug remarks. Tonight's family dinner at their estate in Port Crest was supposed to be routine, civil, maybe even peaceful. Rachel had just been assigned a major financial fraud investigation, one that could define her entire career. What she didn't know was that the company under federal scrutiny belonged to Victoria. And when Victoria smirked across the table and said, "She's just a simple accountant," Rachel knew something Victoria didn't. That simple accountant was about to become her worst nightmare. Before I dive into how it all unfolded, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. And if this opening grabbed you, hit that like and subscribe button. This story's just getting started. If you had asked me 5 years ago what family meant, I would have said warmth, trust, and shared Sunday dinners. But that was before I married Daniel, and before I met his sister, Victoria Langston. Daniel is kind, principled, and brilliant in quiet ways. He supports my work with the IRS, even when the hours are long and the stress is high. He believes in what I do. Victoria, on the other hand, never has. From the moment I entered the Langston circle, I was measured and always found wanting. My government job was too modest, my clothes too practical, our 3-bedroom home in Port Crest laughably humble by her standards. Victoria likes power the way some people like dessert, sweet, addictive, and never enough. Her real estate company, Langston Development Group, spans 3 counties. She and her husband Nathan live in a sprawling estate with a fountain out front and imported marble in the foyer. She drives a sleek European SUV. I drive a 10-year-old sedan I paid off myself. And that, to her, says everything. It started small, comments made in passing. "You must be so good with numbers, Rachel, working for the IRS and all." Or, "That blazer looks sturdy, government issued." Always with a smile, always just subtle enough to pass. At family gatherings, she'd raise her glass to real risk takers and then glance pointedly in my direction. And Daniel would stay silent. At first, I tried to brush it off. Not everyone has to like me, I told myself. But over time, the silence grew heavier. Victoria's jabs were rarely challenged, and my efforts to remain gracious only fueled her contempt. It wasn't just me she diminished, it was what I stood for. Integrity, structure, and the idea that following the rules mattered. In Victoria's world, rules were things you bent, not followed. The worst part wasn't the insults. It was the way they landed in front of people who mattered to me, the way Daniel would frown, but say nothing, the way her words shaped how others saw me. Reliable, yes, but dull, safe, background noise to Victoria's spotlight. But I've never needed the spotlight. I've built my career in the quiet, behind spreadsheets, audits, and long hours spent tracing missing numbers. I specialize in forensic accounting, the kind that uncovers financial lies too complicated for most people to see. I do work that protects the system, so that people like Victoria don't get away with cheating it. She doesn't know that. Of course, she's never asked. To her, I'm just the woman who married her little brother and brings store-bought wine to her catered events. A simple accountant who still uses coupons and wears last season's shoes. That's fine. She's entitled to her opinions. What she doesn't know, what none of them knew, at least not yet, is that beneath the calm exterior, behind the quiet nods and polite smiles, I was watching, learning, and soon, I'd see her world from a very different vantage point. Because the thing about being underestimated for long enough is that eventually you learn to use it. And when the moment comes, when the numbers don't add up and the truth demands to be seen, it's not the loud ones who deliver the final blow. It's the quiet ones, the ones you never thought could. And Victoria Langston was about to learn that the hard way. 3 months ago, my supervisor at the IRS, Mr. Whitaker, called me into his office without warning. He didn't offer his usual greeting. No coffee, no small talk. Just a thick manila folder on his desk, and a look that said, "This one matters." "Rachel," he said, sliding the file toward me. "I'm assigning you as lead on this. We've got red flags, serious ones." I opened the folder, eyes narrowing as I flipped through the first few pages. Property transfers, offshore accounts, and matching invoices filed through separate subsidiaries. And at the center of it all, Langston Development Group. At that point, the name meant nothing more to me than a company listed in the Portcrest real estate database. I didn't make the connection to Victoria. Not yet. I remember the twinge of anticipation, the kind that only comes when you're about to take on something that could define your entire career. This wasn't just a random audit. The early indicators pointed to something deliberate: strategic misreporting, creative bookkeeping, and suspicious entity shifts across state lines. In my line of work, we call that smoke, and smoke usually leads to fire. Mr. Whitaker's voice was steady but firm. "This needs to be airtight. Langston has friends in high places. If this goes to court, they'll come hard. We need bulletproof numbers and airtight timelines." I nodded, already mentally clearing my schedule. This was the kind of case forensic accountants dream of: high stakes, complex structure, and the potential to unravel something much larger than a bad balance sheet. I spent the next several days buried in records, bank statements, developer contracts, and tax filings from the last 5 years. The deeper I went, the more troubling the patterns became. Properties were flipped between shell companies with no clear revenue trail. Expenses inflated just below the threshold for audit triggers. Deferred income is structured to bypass quarterly tax liability. Someone at Langston knew exactly what they were doing. And whoever they weren't working alone. Each night, Daniel would peek into my home office with a tray, dinner, tea, sometimes just a glass of water and a quiet nod. He knew better than to ask questions. He knew that once I hit this level of focus, I became a different version of myself: deliberate, meticulous, relentless. "This could be huge for you," he said one night, gently rubbing the tension from my shoulders. "You've earned this." I smiled, grateful for his support. But part of me still carried the weight of every dinner table insult from Victoria. The way she made my work feel small, even as I built something meaningful from it. And yet, none of that connected. Not yet. The on-site investigation was scheduled to begin the following Tuesday. The plan was to quietly visit Langston's corporate headquarters, request records, conduct interviews with financial officers, and begin a full forensic audit. I was confident, prepared, and ready. But that Friday, Daniel reminded me of something that derailed everything. "Don't forget," he said. "Victoria's hosting the annual Langston dinner tomorrow night. She'll kill me if we don't show." I paused, blinking. I'd been so absorbed in the case that I'd completely forgotten the invitation. My instinct was to decline. I needed the weekend to finalize audit protocols. But Daniel's face softened. "It's just a few hours. We'll be in and out. Besides, you never know. Maybe she'll actually behave this time." I almost laughed at that. But against my better judgment, I agreed. The irony, of course, is that I walked into that dinner thinking I was just a guest, an outsider tolerated for the sake of family. I had no idea I was walking straight into the center of the investigation. No idea that the company I'd spent weeks dissecting, anonymously, professionally, objectively, was run by the very woman who'd spent years mocking everything I stood for. No idea that by Sunday morning, the case would no longer be about numbers on paper, but about faces across the dinner table. And my name was no longer just Rachel Monroe, the quiet IRS investigator. By Monday, I'd be the one person standing between Victoria Langston and a federal indictment. The investigation had just become personal. But I wasn't there to settle scores. I was there to uphold the truth, no matter who it exposed. By Saturday morning, I was deep into my audit strategy. The whiteboard in my office had become a web of numbers, shell companies, flagged payments, and misaligned entity structures. I had mapped every suspicious transaction Langston Development Group had made in the last 5 years. At that point, it was still just numbers to me, patterns, financial smoke see. It wasn't personal, not yet. I'd skipped breakfast, half-drunk coffee cooling beside my keyboard. When Daniel stepped into the room, "You've been at it for hours," he said gently. "Don't forget about tonight." I looked up, confused. The Langston dinner, he reminded me. Victoria's annual family gathering. "You said we'd go." My stomach dropped. In all my focus, I had completely erased that from my mind. And the last place I wanted to be, on the eve of a major investigation, was in Victoria Langston's dining room, smiling through another evening of subtle insults and forced politeness. "I really should stay here," I said. "This case is complicated. I'm close to finalizing our entry strategy." Daniel crossed the room and leaned against the doorframe. "I know," he said, "but this means a lot to my parents. Just a couple of hours, in and out, then you can get back to whatever this." He gestured toward the whiteboard. "Is." I sighed. "Do I have to talk to her?" He smiled. "Only if you want to. Just be your brilliant, unshakable self. She'll have nothing to say." If only that were true. By late afternoon, I had packed away the documents and slipped into a simple navy dress. Practical, appropriate, and undoubtedly already dated by Victoria's standards. As we drove across Port Crest, Daniel made small talk. I barely heard it. My mind was still with the numbers, the LLCs, the gaps in reporting. Still, nothing in those files had linked directly to Victoria. Not yet. It wasn't until we turned onto the winding road that led to the Langston estate that the first flicker of unease crept in. The company name, Langston Development Group, had felt familiar from the moment I opened the file. But Port Crest was small. Developers came and went. Langston wasn't exactly an uncommon surname. Still, the timing, the scale, the presence. It all began to press at the edge of something I didn't yet want to admit. Their estate came into view. A sweeping Tudor-style mansion with marble columns and a circular drive. Every inch of it whispered wealth, control, image. 2 luxury cars already sat parked beside Victoria's signature black SUV. As we pulled in, I felt my throat tighten. Not because of the case, but because of the woman waiting inside. "Deep breath," Daniel whispered as we stepped out. "It's just dinner." Victoria opened the door in a designer dress that looked like it had been stitched from someone else's mortgage. She air-kissed Daniel on both cheeks, then turned to me with her usual tight smile. "Rachel," she said. "So glad you could make it." She hugged me briefly. Perfunctory. Cool. The kind of hug you give someone you barely tolerate, and only because others are watching. Inside, the foyer spilled into a 2-story great room, where her curated guest list had already begun to gather. Polished, charming, and perfectly arranged. I recognized some of Daniel's extended relatives, a few business associates of Nathan's, and, unexpectedly, Clarissa Hale, Victoria's business partner. Clarissa's presence gave me pause. I'd seen her name once, maybe twice, buried in subsidiary filings under the company's secondary entities. I hadn't focused on her. Not yet. Victoria ushered us toward the bar cart, where top-shelf liquor waited beside cut crystal tumblers. "You simply must see the renovations," she chirped. "We just finished the East Wing." For the next 20 minutes, we were paraded through the house: custom tile, imported fixtures, hand-carved woodwork from Italy. Daniel made polite noises. I trailed behind, increasingly aware that the extravagance I was seeing mirrored the very kind of spending the audit had flagged as suspicious. I began mentally cross-referencing square footage, renovation dates, cost estimates. It still could have been a coincidence. But then we reached what Victoria called her home office suite, and everything shifted. Nathan was stepping out of the room as we approached, closing the door behind him with uncharacteristic speed. He looked startled, almost rattled. Through the brief crack of the door, I caught a glimpse of Clarissa gathering papers from a massive desk. "Oh, it's a mess," Nathan said quickly. "Reg's work stuff. Nothing to see." Something in his voice didn't sit right. Something too defensive, too rehearsed. "What kind of work do you bring home?" I asked casually. Victoria waved a manicured hand. "Just some investment documents, property projections. Nothing thrilling, darling." But then, I heard Clarissa's voice, low, urgent, from inside the room. "We need to fix these books before anyone sees them. The timing couldn't be worse." I froze. My breath caught. In that moment, a terrible thought anchored itself in my mind. Sharp, clear, and undeniable. What if the company I was preparing to investigate belonged to her? What if this were Langston Development Group? What if Victoria wasn't just the woman who made my life miserable at dinner parties, but the woman hiding millions in financial fraud? As we moved away from Victoria's office suite, something in me shifted. A voice I'd learned to trust, professional, quiet, persistent, was whispering, "Something's not right." I kept that voice close as we returned to the main room, where laughter drifted from the fireplace and glasses clinked over polite, curated conversation. Victoria had rejoined the crowd, slipping seamlessly back into her role as hostess and queenmaker. Clarissa followed not long after, face composed, posture perfect, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted too quickly, lingered too long. I took my seat near the fireplace, alone for a moment while Daniel spoke with his cousin Malcolm. Across the room, Victoria held court, animatedly describing her company's latest project, a luxury condominium tower. She announced, glass in hand, 60% of units already spoken for, at an average of 1.2 million each. There were appreciative murmurs from the group. Someone raised their glass. "That's quite an achievement," said Martin Langston, Nathan's father. Victoria smiled. "It's all about timing, and knowing how to bend the rules when you need to." The words slipped out so casually, as if they were part of her charm. But to someone like me, trained to listen for intent, they landed like gunfire. Bend the rules. That phrase, so often used by those who think ethics are optional. I forced a smile and took a slow sip of wine, watching. Clarissa was standing just behind Victoria now, nodding along, her smile tight. She caught my gaze for a second, just long enough for her expression to falter. Then she turned away. Later, during cocktail hour, Clarissa drifted over to where I stood. Her movements were elegant, rehearsed. She wore a black cocktail dress and the kind of red lipstick that announced confidence, but her fingers trembled ever so slightly around her glass. "So, Rachel," she began lightly, "Victoria tells me you work for the government." I nodded. "That's right. I'm with the IRS." She blinked. Just once. Then smiled. How fascinating. That must be very structured work. It has its moments, I replied, watching her face. Especially when we're assigned large-scale investigations. Financial crime, mostly. Corporate fraud. Clarissa's grip tightened on her glass. Oh, she said. What kind of criteria would trigger something like that? I was about to answer when Victoria swept over, linking her arm through Clarissa's. Are you boring poor Rachel with business talk? She chirped. Dinner's being served. Come. We made our way into the dining room, a chandelier-lit space that felt more like a showroom than a place where people shared meals. Each place setting was flawless. Fine china, crystal glasses, ornate candlesticks. At the center of the table, an elaborate floral arrangement made conversation almost impossible. I found my name card between Daniel and Martin, directly across from Victoria and Nathan. Clarissa took her seat further down, visibly tenser than before. The first course arrived, beet salad with candied walnuts and goat cheese. I barely tasted it. My mind was 1,000 miles away, replaying Clarissa's reaction, Victoria's language, the way Nathan had shielded the office, the way Clarissa had whispered fix the books before anyone sees them. And still, no one had said the company name out loud, not once. If they had, I might have walked out right then. Instead, I tried to breathe, tried to smile, tried to be present. But even as Victoria raised her glass for yet another self-congratulatory toast, I felt it building. Not dread, not fear, but clarity. I wasn't here by accident. Not tonight. Not in this house. Not with this company. I had come to this dinner thinking I was just a guest. But as the second course was served, beef tenderloin with truffle potatoes, I realized something much larger was unfolding. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a near miss. This was the case. And Victoria Langston was the name behind the numbers. By the time dessert was being served, an extravagant chocolate creation with gold leaf and imported berries, I could barely keep my hands from trembling. I needed a moment, a quiet place, somewhere away from Victoria's voice, the clinking glasses, and the growing knot in my stomach. I'm just going to freshen up, I whispered to Daniel, placing my napkin gently on the table. He nodded, distracted by the conversation. I stepped out into the hallway and turned toward the guest bathroom, one I remembered from a previous visit, tucked quietly at the far end of the house. My heels echoed softly on the marble floor. My breath, slow and deliberate, tried to calm the rapid beating of my heart. Inside, the bathroom was absurdly luxurious. Floor-to-ceiling marble, gold fixtures, a hand-poured lavender candle flickering beside a porcelain sink. Even the hand towels were monogrammed. I splashed cool water on my face, willing myself to breathe. But as I reached for a towel, something caught my eye. Behind the vase of orchids on the counter, a stack of papers, shoved hastily, as if hidden in a rush. I froze. I didn't move at first, just stared. Every instinct I had told me to walk away. But I was also a federal investigator, standing in the home of someone whose behavior had raised every red flag I'd ever been trained to spot. Slowly, carefully, I reached behind the vase and slid the top few pages free. My breath hitched. There it was. At the top of the page, Langston Development Group, in bold, centered, and beneath it, financial projections for the upcoming quarter, revenue breakdowns, expense categories, projected growth. Except, the numbers didn't match. Not with the filings I had already reviewed back at the office. These figures were significantly higher. I flipped to the next page. Columns, neatly labeled, reported, and actual. It wasn't just a budget estimate, it was a dual bookkeeping system. Side-by-side columns showing exactly how much income had been concealed, how much had been shifted, hidden, and misreported. This was it. Not speculation, not theory, evidence, hard, tangible, irrefutable evidence of financial fraud. I glanced toward the door, still closed, still silent. Then I pulled my phone from my clutch and began snapping photos. Quick, clean shots of each page, angles, labels, headers. I moved with quiet precision, years of training guiding every motion. When I finished, I carefully returned the papers to their place, tucked just as I had found them, behind the vase. Then I straightened, adjusted my dress, and stared at myself in the gilded mirror above the sink. This was no longer just Victoria's condescension, no longer about comments over wine, or cheap jabs about government work. This was fraud, and I had the proof. I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. The house hummed around me with laughter and wine-fueled chatter. The music had shifted to something jazzy and low. For a moment, it all felt strangely surreal. This polished world continuing on, oblivious to the storm about to arrive. As I returned to the dining room, I could feel the shift inside myself. My tears were gone, replaced by something colder, calmer. Not revenge, not anger. Focus. I took my seat. Victoria barely noticed, too busy telling a story about her recent business trip to Tokyo. The investors were so impressed, she said, lifting her glass. They committed $5 million on the spot. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, the echo of what I'd just read still buzzing in my ears. She didn't know. She had no idea what I'd seen. No idea that the woman she'd spent years mocking, this simple accountant, was now the one holding the keys to her undoing. I sat silently, the dessert untouched in front of me, while Victoria launched into yet another polished tale about her Tokyo presentation. Her voice floated above the table, confident, theatrical, designed to command the room. But I wasn't listening anymore. Not really. My mind was back in the guest bathroom, replaying the columns labeled reported and actual, the whispers from Clarissa, the numbers that didn't match, the photos now sitting on my phone. I had evidence, but I also had to play it smart. Professional ethics forbade confrontation, especially in this setting. And so, I smiled faintly. I sipped water. I waited. Until the moment I was dragged, unwillingly, into the spotlight. So, Rachel, Martin Langston said from the far end of the table. Daniel tells us you were just promoted. Congratulations. I opened my mouth to respond, but Victoria didn't wait. Yes, she cut in, her tone lilting. Rachel's climbing the ladder in government work. From what cubicle to what cubicle again? Dear polite laughter rippled around the table. Not cruel, just compliant. Daniel shifted in his seat, but said nothing. I drew a breath. Actually, I was promoted to senior investigative accountant. I now lead federal investigations into financial crimes and tax fraud. There was a pause. Patricia, Martin's wife, leaned forward with genuine interest. That sounds quite impressive. What sort of investigations do you handle? Before I could answer, Victoria laughed, loudly. Oh, Mother, don't encourage her. It's all just pushing papers and checking receipts. Rachel's job is to make sure someone didn't claim too many pens as business expenses. The table chuckled again. This time, I felt it deeper. She stood then, wineglass in hand, her voice rising with performative flair. Let me tell you about Rachel's thrilling life, she said, turning to the guests. She wakes up every morning, puts on her sensible government blazer, drives her modest little car, and spends her day counting, adding, subtracting, making sure no poor teacher deducted an extra marker from their tax return. More laughter. Even Daniel gave a weak, apologetic smile. He didn't laugh, but he didn't stop it either. My face burned. My hands curled in my lap beneath the tablecloth. And while some of us, Victoria continued, are closing million-dollar deals and managing real impact, Rachel ensures the system runs. Predictably, she raised her glass. To predictability. I sat frozen, humiliation seeping through my skin. Years of being underestimated, belittled, and patronized all resurfaced in that single moment. And still, Daniel said nothing. I suppose someone has to keep the rules in line, Victoria added, smirking. Isn't that right, Rachel? I forced myself to speak, though my voice was quieter than I intended. My work, I said evenly, ensures our tax system functions fairly. It protects against abuse, and it holds even the most powerful accountable. Oh, of course, sweetie, Victoria replied, her tone dripping with condescension. We're all very impressed with your calculator skills. The last of the laughter felt thinner now, more uncertain. I looked across the table to Clarissa, who was staring down at her plate, to Nathan, whose brow had furrowed ever so slightly, to Daniel, who was still studying his food, lips pressed into a tight, silent line. I waited, hoped, but the defense never came. So I stood, too quickly. My chair scraped loudly against the floor. Excuse me, I said, voice clipped. I need some air. And I left, shoulders square, steps even, heart splintered. I didn't go to the powder room. I didn't go to cry. I went to breathe, to reclaim the piece of myself that Victoria tried to humiliate. Because I knew something she didn't. I wasn't just the quiet one at the table. I was the storm building just beyond her horizon. I stood in the hallway, back pressed lightly against the wall, eyes closed. The laughter from the dining room had dulled, less vibrant now, more performative than genuine. Victoria's performance had landed, yes, but not the way she intended. Something had shifted, not in her, but in me. Because tonight, I had crossed a line, not one of ethics, one of certainty. Up until this point, I had suspected, I had compiled patterns, overheard whispers, and captured numbers. But now, I knew. Langston Development Group, the company I was assigned to investigate, was hers. Victoria Langston wasn't just a difficult sister-in-law with expensive taste and sharper words. She was the principal figure in a developing federal case, and I was no longer just an uncomfortable guest at her table. I was her auditor. I returned to the dining room as dessert plates were being cleared. Victoria had launched into another business anecdote, arms moving, wineglass in hand. This time, her story centered on asset restructuring, how strategic movement between entities had helped minimize exposure. Her voice was smooth, practiced. But I wasn't the only one listening more closely now. Clarissa looked pale. Nathan sat unusually still. And then, my phone buzzed. I glanced down. Text from Agent Coleman. Need to confirm, 9 a.m. Start at Langston HQ tomorrow. New whistleblower doc in hand. Bringing hard copies. Where are you? My breath caught in my throat. I typed back quickly. At Langston's residence. Family dinner. Do not come inside. Too risky. A pause. Then his reply. The director says, deliver in person. The situation escalated. I'm 5 minutes out. My pulse surged. I glanced at Victoria, still in command of the room, still completely unaware. I rose quietly and stepped out into the foyer. I dialed Agent Coleman directly. Rachel. He answered on the first ring. Tell me exactly what's happening. I've just confirmed. I said quietly. This is her company. Langston Development belongs to Victoria. She's my sister-in-law. Silence. Then, you're going to have to recuse. I know, I said. But there's more. I found physical documents earlier tonight, hidden in the bathroom. Dual bookkeeping, concealed income. It's real. Coleman, it's serious. I've got new intel, he said. Whistleblower came forward 20 minutes ago. Testimony confirms offshore accounts, altered invoices, false declarations. I exhaled slowly. Does Whitaker know he's authorized immediate escalation? I'm arriving with full documentation. As we spoke, the doorbell rang. Its chime echoed through the quiet foyer and drifted into the dining room, silencing conversation. Through the glass, I saw Agent Coleman, professional, composed, holding a leather portfolio under one arm. The front door opened before I could reach it. Victoria had answered herself. "Oh," she said, voice coated in charm. "Good evening. Can I help you?" Agent Coleman's voice was calm, measured. "Yes, ma'am. I'm looking for Rachel Monroe. I was told she's attending a family dinner here tonight." Victoria hesitated. I stepped forward. "He's with me." She turned, confused, lips parting just slightly. "Rachel, what is this?" Before I could answer, Agent Coleman spoke again. "I have documents you need to review. They concern a federal investigation." Victoria blinked. "That's not possible. This is a private event. Whatever paperwork you have can wait until Monday." Agent Coleman's voice shifted, slightly firmer now. "No, ma'am, it can't. Mrs. Monroe is the assigned federal auditor on the case, and based on our findings, you should be very concerned." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever felt. No one in the room moved. The ornate grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner. Clarissa's fork slipped from her hand. And slowly, Victoria turned, her eyes locking with mine. "What is he talking about?" "Rachel?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "This is a joke." Right, I stepped forward, taking the portfolio from Agent Coleman. "I didn't know," I said, voice calm. "Not until tonight. But yes, your company is under investigation. And I was assigned the case." Her face went pale. Daniel stood now, a question forming on his lips. But I didn't wait. I opened the folder, scanning the contents. New emails, signed instructions, irregular transfers. Agent Coleman's voice returned, quiet but resolute. "We've confirmed financial misconduct. The case has been upgraded. Possible charges include tax fraud and money laundering." Nathan's wine glass tipped, red spilling across white linen like ink spreading through water. Clarissa stood. I need air," she whispered, before stumbling from the room. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted, not loudly, not with fireworks, but with truth, with the quiet weight of evidence no performance could erase. Victoria had spent years laughing at my work, but now she was the subject of it. Victoria stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still on the doorknob, as if she could keep the world outside simply by refusing to let go. Her eyes flicked from Agent Coleman to the leather portfolio in my hands, then back to me. "You're the auditor," she said, voice brittle. This is ridiculous." She laughed once, sharp, high, and hollow. "We're at a family dinner. Rachel." What kind of twisted performance is this? Agent Coleman remained steady, posture composed, tone unchanged. "This isn't a performance, ma'am. The documents I've delivered confirm a federal investigation into Langston Development Group, your company. Based on the evidence presented and reviewed, you are the principal subject of that case." You could feel the air drain from the room. Nathan stood slowly from his seat, one hand braced on the edge of the table. "What is he talking about, Victoria?" he asked quietly. "What investigation?" She turned toward him, a practiced calm slipping across her features. But the crack had formed, and no amount of charm could seal it. "Nothing serious," she said with a quick, strained smile. Just an overzealous audit. It's all being handled. I stepped forward, keeping my voice composed. That's not accurate. The investigation has been ongoing for several months. I was assigned the case based on data irregularities and flagged transactions. Until tonight, I didn't know Langston Development was your company. Nathan looked at me, stunned. You're leading the investigation, I was. I said, as of this moment, I'm formally recusing myself due to a personal conflict of interest. But the case will proceed. The evidence speaks for itself. Victoria let out a small, breathy laugh, part disbelief, part desperation. Oh, come on, she said, eyes darting to the guests still seated at the table. This is absurd. It's all just a misunderstanding. I'm sure if we looked at the numbers together, we have, Agent Coleman said quietly, and we've received corroborating testimony from within your organization. Across the room, Eleanor Langston, Nathan's mother, pressed a hand to her mouth. Martin looked thunderstruck. The guests shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances as the elegant dinner unraveled in real time. Victoria's smile began to falter. Rachel, she said, voice lowering, if this is about earlier, the joke I made, this has nothing to do with that, I said flatly. This is about tax evasion, wire fraud, concealment of assets. The numbers don't lie, Victoria, and neither do the documents you left in plain sight. Her gaze narrowed. You went through my things. They were left in the open, I replied. In a guest bathroom. As a federal auditor with reasonable suspicion, I was obligated to document what I saw. Daniel stood now, beside me now. His face was pale but steady, but, you've been under investigation, he said, looking at his sister. And all this time, you acted like you were untouchable. Victoria's eyes snapped to him. You're taking her side. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence answered for him. At the far end of the table, Malcolm leaned toward Lisa, whispering urgently. One of the catering staff discreetly exited through the kitchen. No one was eating anymore. No one was laughing. The room that had once belonged entirely to Victoria now felt like a stage. Too bright, too quiet, too exposed. Agent Coleman broke the silence with measured calm. Mrs. Langston, additional investigators will be arriving in the coming days. You will receive a formal summons and instructions for the next steps. For now, I suggest you consult legal counsel. Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. This is a mistake. It has to be. But her hands, which moments ago held a glass of rare French wine, were now gripping the back of a chair, white-knuckled, trembling. The mask was off, and beneath the polish, the poise, the practiced perfection, stood a woman who had built her empire on illusions, and those illusions were beginning to collapse. The room had gone still. The only sound was the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, and the faint rattle of crystal as Victoria's hand trembled against the back of her chair. I stood across from her, portfolio still in hand, while Agent Coleman observed quietly, waiting, letting her come to terms with what could no longer be denied. But Victoria wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. She took a slow step toward me, her voice lowering, wrapping itself in the softness she reserved for negotiations. Rachel, she began. We're family. I said nothing. She took another step. We've had our differences. I know that. But you're not unreasonable. You understand the weight of things, how delicate reputations can be. I held her gaze, calm and unmoved. What are you asking me, Victoria? She hesitated, just for a moment, then placed her hand lightly on my forearm. I'm asking, she said carefully, if there's any way we can contain this before it spirals out of control, before lawyers and agents and headlines get involved. I felt a slow burn rise in my chest. And by contain, you mean what exactly? Her voice softened further. There's always a way to make things right. A donation, a gesture, something that helps both of us walk away quietly. Then she smiled, the way she used to when she handed out party favors at her fundraisers, like what she was offering me was a gift. I can write a check tonight, she said. Tell me what you need. Agent Coleman stepped forward instantly. Mrs. Langston, he said sharply, are you attempting to offer compensation in exchange for obstruction of a federal investigation? Victoria flinched at the wording. I'm trying to resolve a misunderstanding. You're attempting to bribe a federal agent, he corrected. That's a felony. She withdrew her hand from my arm like she'd touched fire. Of course not, she said, suddenly flustered. I'm simply asking my sister-in-law for advice. I looked at her, this woman who had spent years belittling my career, dismissing my work, underestimating everything I stood for. And now, here she was, offering checks, hiding desperation beneath a polished voice. I can't help you. I said simply, you won't, she snapped. I can't. I repeated, not ethically, not legally. I've already seen too much. Agent Coleman turned to me. Rachel, we'll need to process the evidence you obtained tonight. I can take the files from here. I nodded. Of course. I opened the portfolio, placing the photographed documents, handwritten notes, and my field report in his hands. I'm recusing myself effective immediately. I said, I'll submit my full statement to Director Whitaker tonight. Understood, Coleman replied. We'll assign Special Agent Tran in your place. She's already been briefed. Victoria looked from me to him, disbelief twisting her expression. You're really doing this, she whispered. No, Victoria. I said, you did this. I'm just not covering it up. She took a step back, her composure finally unraveling. Daniel moved to stand beside me now, quiet but present. And for once, he didn't look unsure. He looked like he understood. Agent Coleman turned to him. We'll need to formally follow up in the coming days. But for now, I suggest you both leave. This environment is no longer appropriate for a federal agent involved in the case. I nodded and turned to go. Victoria's voice followed me across the marble floor. I was trying to protect everything we built, she hissed. You don't understand what it takes to hold a life like this together. I paused, turned back to face her one last time. You built it on fraud, I said softly. And some of us actually live by what we sign our names to. Then I walked out, not triumphant, not vindicated, but clear and unshaken, because the truth doesn't need volume to stand tall. Sometimes, it just needs someone who refuses to look away. We were nearly at the door when we heard it. Clarissa's voice, strained and trembling, rising from the far end of the dining room. I can't do this anymore. Daniel and I stopped, turning back. Agent Coleman paused beside us, silent but alert. Clarissa stood by the window now, one hand gripping the back of a chair, her other clutching a cocktail napkin like it might steady her. Her lipstick was smudged, and for the first time all evening, the polish had cracked. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking, but I can't lie for you anymore. Victoria. All eyes turned to her. No one said a word. Clarissa drew a breath, then looked directly at Agent Coleman. You don't need a subpoena. I'll talk. I'll give you everything. Victoria's head snapped around. What are you doing? She demanded. Clarissa flinched. What I should have done months ago. The silence that followed was suffocating. Everyone was listening now. The family, the guests, the servers frozen mid-clearing. Even the chandelier above seemed to hold its breath. Clarissa stepped forward, eyes shining. I knew about the offshore accounts, about the fake Tokyo investors. The Westlake Project. It's underwater. The Clayton Heights development built on land we don't fully own. And the tax filings. Victoria and Harrison had been falsifying those for years. Victoria's face turned ashen. Clarissa, she warned, her voice dangerously low. Stop talking. But Clarissa didn't. I told her it was too risky. I begged her to back off. But she wouldn't listen. She kept saying we'd fix it later, cover it up, move the money around. There were fake invoices, backdated contracts, and shell companies we used to inflate assets. At first, I thought it was just aggressive accounting. But it wasn't. It was fraud. And it was constant. Victoria lunged forward. Shut up, she snapped. Not another word. But Nathan was already moving. He stepped between them, holding up a hand to block her. Enough, he said. The word was simple, but it shattered everything. Victoria froze. Nathan turned to Clarissa, his voice tight, low. Is all of that true? Clarissa nodded slowly. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I didn't know everything at first, but when I figured it out, I was already in too deep. Nathan looked at his wife now, really looked at her. What else? Victoria. What haven't you told me? Her mouth opened, but no words came, just silence. Then, from the back of the room, Eleanor's voice shook as she asked, Victoria, did you really do all this? Victoria's hands clenched at her sides. Her voice, when it finally came, was defiant. I did what I had to do. The market was crashing. The investors were pulling back. If I hadn't acted, we would have lost everything. You acted by lying, Nathan asked. I acted by surviving, she snapped. By protecting what we built. You think money just appears out of thin air? No, he said. But I didn't think it came from laundering either. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Agent Coleman stepped forward, addressing Clarissa. Miss Hale, we'll need a formal statement. Your cooperation may be taken into consideration in the federal case. Clarissa nodded, still visibly shaking. Victoria turned to her, venom in her voice. You think this will save you? You think betraying me will protect you from what's coming? No, Clarissa whispered. Clarissa. But it might save me from becoming you. Victoria stared at her, stunned. And in that silence, heavy and breathless, her empire, her alliances, her carefully guarded image, began to collapse. Not with an explosion, but with a confession, and the courage of one woman who finally chose the truth. The house emptied slowly that night. Guests slipped out with murmured goodbyes, avoiding eye contact. The staff cleared half-eaten plates in silence, and in the center of it all, Victoria stood like a statue, still, pale, watching her kingdom unravel. Nathan didn't speak to her again. He walked Clarissa to the door, thanked Agent Coleman with a firm nod, and turned back only once, to look at his wife with a grief that went deeper than anger. Then he left. Daniel and I rode home in silence. The weight of the evening pressed in around us, heavy, undeniable. But it wasn't just what had happened to Victoria. It was what had changed in him. When we got home, he poured 2 glasses of wine. Not expensive, not symbolic, just simple, real. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't speak. I waited. For not seeing it. He continued. For standing by while she humiliated you. For thinking silence was neutral when it was really complicity. I looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, I saw him clearly. Not just as my husband, but as someone finally choosing to show up. You stood beside me tonight, I said. That mattered. I should have stood beside you years ago. He said it with no defensiveness, no excuses, just truth. 2 days later, the news broke. The charges against Victoria Langston included tax fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Langston Development Group was placed under federal receivership, all assets frozen. Investigators were seen entering the Port Crest office building before sunrise. By the end of the week, Nathan had filed for legal separation. His statement to the press was brief. "I was unaware of the full extent of the company's activities. I am cooperating fully and focusing on rebuilding a future with integrity. And me, I filed my final report and submitted my recusal paperwork. Within hours, Director Whitaker called me into his office. 'You handled this with professionalism most wouldn't have managed,' he said, setting a folder on the desk between us. 'There's an opening for Division Supervisor. Special Investigations Unit. We think it fits you.' I stared at him, stunned. It would mean leading a team. He continued. 'Complex cases, high visibility, and, frankly, a lot of pressure.' 'I'm not afraid of pressure,' I said. He smiled. 'I know. That's why it's yours. If you want it.' I did. Not for revenge, not to prove anything to Victoria or her circle, but because I had earned it. Through the quiet choices, through the work no one claps for, through every moment, I stayed grounded in truth, even when it cost me. A week later, I stood in my new office. Larger, yes, but still simple, practical. Mine. Daniel dropped by with lunch, a sandwich from our favorite deli. No flowers, no fanfare, just a smile. 'I'm proud of you,' he said. 'Not just for what you did, but for who you are.' And for once, I let myself feel it. Not pride in Victoria's downfall, but in the rise that followed. For me, for truth, for integrity. Because some things don't shine on the surface, they shine when tested. Spring arrived quietly in Port Crest. The trial never happened. Instead, Victoria Langston accepted a plea deal. 3 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release, and over $12 million in restitution. Most of her properties were seized. Langston Development was dissolved. The headlines faded within weeks, but the impact lingered long after the cameras left. 2 weeks after the sentencing, a letter arrived at my office. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting careful. It was from her. "Rachel, I've had time to think. Too much time, honestly. But clarity doesn't always come in boardrooms or at gala dinners. Sometimes, it comes in the quiet. I mocked you for years, thinking I was better, smarter, stronger. I see now. What I called ambition was just fear in a tailored suit. You never raised your voice. You never needed to. You stood your ground with nothing but truth. And I never saw how rare that was. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know. I understand now what real success looks like. It looks like you." I read it twice, then set it down gently, not out of anger, not out of triumph, but because for the first time, her words felt honest. That fall, I accepted a part-time invitation to speak at the university's School of Business, a course on forensic ethics, just once a week. Just enough to share what I'd learned about the numbers behind the fraud. Yes, but more than that, about what it means to hold the line when no one else will. On the last day of class, a student asked me what it felt like to be part of such a high-profile case. I paused, then said simply, "Success isn't what it looks like from the outside. It's what it feels like when you lay your head down at night, knowing you told the truth, even when no one else would." They nodded, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not because I'd brought anyone down, but because I had stood up for the right thing, the right way. That's the part Victoria never understood. And maybe, just maybe, she does now. That letter didn't undo the damage, but it reminded me. Some lessons echo louder in silence than in apology. Success isn't built on status or noise, it's built on choices, quiet ones, steady ones, honest ones. And sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't just change your life, it helps define what integrity looks like for the people watching. If this story spoke to something in you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or stood your ground when it counted, leave a comment. And if you'd like to hear more stories about quiet strength and earned respect, don't forget to like and subscribe, because sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room is the one that never needed to shout.